For Politics PA, this is Voices of Reason, brought to you by Broad and Liberty. I'm your host, Steve Ulrich. We took a couple of weeks off to recover from the 2024 election. We'll take a look today at the ramifications of that election and what to look forward to in 2025 with our guests from Broad and Liberty. First, Beth Ann Rosica, Terry Tracy, Kyle Salmon, and Todd Shepard. Welcome all. Terry, I'll start with you. Let's take a look back at the ramifications of the 2024 election. Pennsylvanians awarded Donald Trump the state and his 19 electoral votes. The state booted out three-time incumbent Democratic Senator Bob Casey, put Dave McCormick in place, retained the state Senate, which was expected, did not reverse the state House, which perhaps was not expected. Your thoughts?
I guess, in an effort to try to say something that hasn't already been said, the thing that has, because most of our coverage is in the metropolitan Philadelphia area, the question that I've been asking myself is the progressive moment that captured the imagination of southeastern Pennsylvania politics during the first Trump term, is that over? Has that moment passed? Has the fever sort of broken from the pandemic? And if we entered, it's not a return to normalcy per se, it's a new phase or a new chapter. To me, I think that many of the Democrats who were elected at the local level, county governments, municipal governments, state legislative seats, were almost surprised, I think, when they got elected in 2016, 2017, 2018. They ran against, GOP machines in the Southeast that had been in power since the Civil War, had not lost an election since the Civil War. And then in 2 or 3 consecutive elections, the Republican Party in the Southeast just started to hemorrhage votes, money, elected officials, and the Democrats were swept into power. And I think the Democrats in southeastern Pennsylvania may have, we'll see, overread their mandate. And they used federal funds from ARPA and CARES and things like that to pass what was sweeping policy changes in southeastern Pennsylvania. And the bill is coming due for that. And the conversation after the results of the presidential election in the Southeast pivoted very quickly to things like county budgets. And what are we going to do when ARPA money runs out? And as the dust is settling, what are the political implications of all these things? So to me, I think one of the things we'll be watching very closely in 2025 is, has that progressive moment passed? Again, that doesn't mean Republicans are going to go back to winning all elections, but is that uber progressive moment that was really funneled by or fueled by animosity towards Trump and all of the issues that came up during the pandemic era, are we entering a new phase? And what does that look like and what does it mean?
Kyle, let me ask you, did the Democrats squander their opportunity or the Republicans make gains and improve their brand?
I think, like Terry said, I think when they came to office, it was a genuinely progressive trend that brought them in. You noted all the different elections, and the one that stood out is the state house stayed Democrat. I think they're probably seeing that as a mandate, but what they should be seeing it as is the effect of the district lines that kept them in power despite having about a 300,000 vote loss in the statewide House race. That's something that's not really mentioned a lot. It used to be mentioned all the time when it went the other way.
It's only mentioned in the New York Times when they talk about the Senate and how anti-democratic it is, right? But it's never mentioned when it...
And, part of it is because the gerrymander, and that's what it is because it was all drawn to benefit one party, was it doesn't look as gross on the maps, but they did violate the general rules about keeping communities together, keeping counties and townships together in a way that it's like every choice you could justify, but every choice benefited the Democrats. So they got reelected on that, despite losing statewide like all the other Democrats did. And I think they're going to continue to overread a little bit because that's what you do when you win. Just like I think the people are overreading Trump's mandate nationwide. I mean, he won the popular vote for whatever that's worth. It wasn't like a Reagan landslide, but I know there are people in a couple of weeks who are going to say, all right, now the whole country's with us. Just like when Bush won re-election, he said, all right, now let's talk about privatizing Social Security. Everyone said, no, we know you just want a big mandate, but nobody signed up for that. So I think winning produces hubris every time.
Beth Ann, your thoughts? Did the Democrats squander or did the Republicans remake themselves?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that the Democrats, particularly the progressive arm of the Democratic Party, really overestimated what was important to the voters. I cover education issues. I look at things like boys playing in girls' sports. And the Democrats really pushed hard, the progressives pushed hard on that issue when it's polling at 70, 80% of people in the country don't think that boys should be playing in girls' sports. And yet here in Pennsylvania, we have language that says that boys can basically play in girls' sports. So I think that and that was pushed by really Josh Shapiro's administration to get that done. So I do think that the Democrats overestimate what is important to the average voter. And I think to average voters, that is an important issue, and they don't seem to understand that. But I also think that Republicans, have their flaws in all of this as well. And I think that, in particular, I think the Republican Party is going to have a hard time coming together on the important issues that need to be addressed and reaching consensus. So I think that it's going to be an interesting and challenging year ahead of us to see what happens.
Todd, it almost seems like Democrats are beginning to reject some of those progressive moves. You see John Fetterman reaching out to Republicans and showing almost a willingness that Democrats never thought they would ever do, to offer an olive branch to Republicans. Are you seeing the same thing?
Well, look, I mean, we saw some of that courage from John Fetterman previously, right, with regards to the Hamas war with Israel. So, we saw that he was willing to be a maverick in some instances. And so the fact now that he's pivoted away from international politics and he's being mavericky on more domestic issues, like the immigration law that was recently was recently passed in the U.S. House. I think he's just sort of kind of continuing to stretch out with those feelers. I think the real test is whether or not you start to see someone in suburban settings do the same thing, right? Is there someone, maybe like someone that was a long-serving Democrat, in one of the collar counties on a county commission, who has the willingness to, in public, and look, if it happened behind closed doors, that'd be one thing. But if you do it in public, that's even more. So, would there be that kind of Democrat that would maybe say, you know what, I don't think Bucks County suing oil producers is really conducive to the whole political morale of the moment, or something similar in Chester County or Delaware County. So, while I appreciate the question, I just don't think John Fetterman's a bellwether in that sense, because he was starting to show his willingness to really extend himself that way. Matter of fact, just yesterday I saw, our colleague Albert Eisenberg. He tweeted. He said, "Honestly, if this keeps up, I wouldn't be surprised in another 4 years if John Fetterman is caucusing independently." And quite honestly, like a Kirsten Sinema, if he keeps it up, I could see that actually happening. So, yeah, there's a lot to be sorted out along those lines still.
Well, and Fetterman might be a different kind of dude, but he is a masterful politician. And so I think he has done a much better job of having his finger on the pulse of Pennsylvania and Pennsylvanians. And he's been warning the Democratic Party for months, really, that the outcome that happened in November was what the trend lines were showing. And I think it was after Musk got involved with the campaign publicly that Fetterman really started to ring the alarm bells and say, this is heading in the wrong direction. I think more notable, while it's not a Pennsylvania example, but there was a piece in Politico recently where the senator from Hawaii, Brian Schatz, who's like probably on the short list to take over for Chuck Schumer as majority or minority leader in the Senate, leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and is certainly regarded as a Washington fixture and an establishment Democrat in Washington, we started to say things like, we have been listening to the advocate class way too much. We're not listening to the people. It's the Democratic Party has become beholden to these advocacy groups, and it's not necessarily that he disagreed with the issues themselves. It was more, he said, it's the way that they talk about the issues and the way that they orient themselves around the issues and the way they prioritize the issues. And he gave a really interesting example. He said there were a number of times where he heard Vice President Harris say, I am going to center the economy. And he said, nobody says that. He said, it's like, he said, only Democrats use center as a verb. He said, that's advocacy speak. And growing up in California politics, where there's not a meaningful opposition party, the advocacy organizations drive the agenda in Sacramento. She said she would say something like that and not think it was weird. But to someone in Cambria County who's listening to her speak, said, what the hell was she talking about? How do you center the economy? What she meant was, I'm going to make the economy the number one issue in my administration. I understand people are suffering. I understand we need change. We need to do things differently. Someone who's like, they were like, oh, that makes sense. When she says, I'm going to censor this for you, like, what the hell was she talking
Bill
about?
Clinton could reach out and make a point to someone
Yes.
in one of the rural counties of Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
Statement like that.
And that's where Democrats are missing the boat. I mean, obviously, from my own worldview, I disagree with them on a number of policy issues, but we can have that debate. We're talking about why is their brand so viewed as being so tattered right now? And I think a lot of it is they've lost touch with reality. And frankly, for those of us that have been the belly of the beast in southeastern Pennsylvania, we have seen the real-time effects of that kind of worldview being allowed to basically be unchecked in state and local government.
I want to get to some of the local issues too, but I also want to ask about the election of Dave McCormick, because I think that does raise some questions as well. Will he be the more traditional establishment Republican, or is he going to be more of a MAGA Republican in that regard? Is the Republican tent big enough for both at this point now they're in charge? Kyle, I'll start with you.
I think it's a kind of a big fat Venn diagram. There's so much of, I mean, I was having this conversation with somebody I know the other day who told me, I support the traditional Republicans, but not the MAGA. I'm like, they're mostly the same guys though. Like it's a pretty big overlap. Yes, there's a populist shift and a tone and like a willingness to relate to unions instead of management in some ways. And there's some of those things, but I mean, I think McCormick comes from a traditional Republican background, and he seems like a Reaganite guy to me, but he also, if you listen to him during the campaign, he was picking up on a lot of the discontent of people that is driving them towards those populist issues, the outsourcing, the just sort of the feeling of decline. Like when people say MAGA, I mean, make America great again was a slogan that resonated with people because it does appeal to something that we have kind of neglected for, I mean, at least since the end of the Cold War, is the idea of aspiring to greatness. And that's not a policy, but it's a vibe. And I think McCormick definitely gets that while not being a wild-eyed radical by any means.
Todd?
I think McCormick has an interesting hand to play just because of the timing of things. Look, he's obviously as a U.S. Senator, he's got a 6-year term. The traditions in the Senate used to be like, if you were a newly elected senator, you had to wait sometimes months before you could even make your first speech on the Senate floor, right? Now, that's not those aren't the norms now, but still, nobody expects a new senator to really come in and just start burning the barns down. So really, when you're asking, does he set himself in a MAGA camp or a traditionalist Republican camp or something like that? Quite honestly, I think he's got 2 years to just play a very centrist path and wait for the midterms and then take his cues from the midterms. Because he really, I mean, like his next election, there's really not a whole lot he can do. Barring some catastrophic mistake. I just don't see him doing a lot in the next 2 years that could affect his reelection 6 years from now. And if the midterms went heavily against the Republicans and sent some sort of new message, he picks up on that and adapts. So quite honestly, if I were his chief of staff or his comms director, that's what I would be advocating is let's not get too crazy. Let's be, let's strike a centrist tone for these first couple of years. We'll know more about the course we should take after the 26 midterms.
Let's change gears and turn our attention to education in the Commonwealth. Last year, certainly major discussions in Harrisburg about fair funding of schools. Beth Ann, you cover education for Broad and Liberty. What do you expect in 2025?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think we're a long way off from having any real answers or solutions to how we're going to deal with the funding. It was interesting looking at some data recently, I think put out by the Education Law Center nationwide. And Pennsylvania, out of 2 of 3 metrics, fared very well, scored very high. Pennsylvania has one of the highest funding mechanisms in the country as far as states go, rated an A rating, A to F scale, in terms of the amount of funding that is provided for education. Where the state has not done well is distribution of funding. So there are districts that are, in the opinion of this report, overfunded and districts that are underfunded. I've looked a lot at the test results we use in Pennsylvania. You can argue that standardized tests aren't a great metric. I don't necessarily think they're the best metric, but they're the only metric we have right now. So I tend to look at those at least as one yardstick of how things are going. And correlating funding to test scores, there's no real differences there. Quite frankly, across the state of Pennsylvania, about half of our students are proficient in math. Half of our students, so 50% of our students are not proficient in math, which when you look at a state, regardless of equitable distribution, when you look at a state that's being rated as an A for the amount of money that's being spent on education, that 50% of our students are not functional, proficient in math, we have a big problem on our hands. And I think that no one is really talking about the type of complete overhaul that we need in our education system. And as much as the progressive Democrats don't ever want to talk about school choice and vouchers, I think that it is absolutely incumbent upon us to look at every possible solution, because there's not one solution here for our education crisis. That it is going to take multiple attempts. It's going to take multiple solutions to get at this, because every child is different, every school district is different, every community is different, and we are going to need very much out of the box ideas for how to address this crisis. And we don't have a lot of time. Things were not good before the pandemic and the extended school closures. Test scores were already starting to decline, and the school closures only exacerbated that situation. So this to me should be the number one priority, rather than our government passing legislation that redefines the definition of sex and what is a boy and what is a girl. Why don't we focus on the real issues of what we need to do to get our kids academically ready to compete in this society?
As bad as that 50% number is, it's not the worst number in the mix. There are districts in that data set that 0% are proficient.
Right.
But I'm going to say that number again.
Right.
0.
Right.
So the only way you can get to 0 is if there is not a single child in the entire district that is proficient in mathematics, and you have some of that in English as well. How is that? Except, are we just shrugging and moving on? It's like, okay, stop the music. There is not a child in that entire school district that can do math at grade level proficiency. If that is not first of all, and by the way, how do you tell a parent whose kid can't add? No, he goes and he sits in that classroom, or she sits there until we just move them up. Not going to learn a damn thing, obviously, not proficient, but you sit there because we told you to sit there. At some point, people have to really start asking some more fundamental questions that are outside of the political context, right? And just saying, this is not a question of right or left, but right or wrong. And the reality is that most of our education battles, to your point about the inefficient allocation of funding in the state, most of our education battles are more geographic than they are actually partisan. I think when you're talking to people and they're being honest with themselves, in the halls of the Capitol or whatever, they know this is broken.
Right.
They know it's broken. And frankly, anybody that is defending the status quo and is not looking at every available avenue of reform, given the amount of money we're spending and the returns we're getting and what's at stake. If you're not part of the let's fix this club, then you're on the wrong side of history.
And I just want to add one thing to that, because one of the districts that you're speaking of, Terry, that has a 0% proficiency in math is Chester Upland School District. And Chester Upland is a district that is in receivership. The state of Pennsylvania is managing that school district, and they have 0% proficiency. So at some point, we have to take a look at the fact that our government is incapable of solving all of these problems because they haven't been able to do it up to this point.
I think just like what you were talking about with how by certain organizations we're rated as a great state for education because they're looking at how much gets spent. I mean, that's looking at it kind of ass backwards, right? I mean, it's like looking at a baseball team and saying, well, the Mets have the highest payroll, but they still stink.
So it's a good
Hey,
example.
that is not a good example, but
They might
okay.
not this year, but
Yankees have a high payroll, but anyway.
all right. But it's like, what is the money buying? What is, we're measuring. It's like, well, if I hire twice as many guys, our product will be twice as good. No, it won't. It's still the same product. What's going into it? And it's like that lawsuit that was supposed to fix anything. It's not going to fix anything because there's no way to fix that in a lawsuit. I mean, even the result of the lawsuit was a 200 some page opinion. And then the judge says, legislature, you got to fix this. It's like, well, they already had to fix it, but you can't mandate that to a constitutional right because that's not how rights work, right? A right is something the government can't take away. You don't have it's like our state constitution has the right to an education, a right to clean air, but those are benefits. They're not natural rights. So it doesn't work that way. We have to actually figure out what's going on in the schools. What is it, the discipline? Like you were saying, the scores were already coming down before COVID. So you can't blame it on that, even though that was also kind of their fault, how long people were out. It's a thorny issue in that, but everyone can look at money and say, well, look at, this district has this many dollars, so that's got to be something, right? But as you're saying, it's mostly not anything.
Yeah, Todd, I'm of age when I remember my parents would never interject when my report card. They'd yell at me. They wouldn't yell at their teachers.
Oh, yeah.
That was just the way it was done. Today, it seems like parents are more involved than ever, and it seems like school districts, essentially, as you mentioned, just kind of push the kids along through the system. You've got 12 years in the scholastic system. You're going to do 12 years whether you're proficient or not. Am I off base there?
Steve, I'm of that age where, yes, my parents would yell at me if my grades were not up to par. Let me answer, see if I can answer your question this way. And that is to say, as I was listening to Beth Ann talk about these and Terry bringing up the 0% proficiency, I just was struck how much that sounded. It was striking similar tones to this debate, this intra-MAGA debate we saw between Vivek Ramaswamy and the others when Ramaswamy tweets out, we have a culture problem in education in this country where we've got too many people watching Saved by the Bell and too many people worshiping the football captain and the homecoming queen and not enough people, not enough kids looking up to the nerds in the class. I'm not saying that's what my fellow panelists were. I'm not saying they were arguing the same thing as Vivek was. But I just think, to borrow the phrase Kyle used earlier, there's a Venn diagram there with some serious overlap. Look, when you're talking about 0% proficiency, at some point we're not just talking about failure. We're also talking about culture. I mean, and when I say culture, I mean in the education institutions and the systematics of the education institutions. And there are culture issues that have to be looked at. And so I'm just struck by the way that whole discussion, even though we weren't talking about the Vivek tweet, how much that reminded me of it.
Let's look again at what we have coming up in 2025. Let's look at Harrisburg. We saw an olive branch reached out to State House with the absence of Representative Matthew Gergely from Allegheny County. The State House right now is 101-101. When they took the first vote for Speaker of the House, tied 101-101. Jesse Topper stepped aside, let Joanna McClinton retain her position as Speaker. Olive branch. But what does that mean going forward? Are we going to see election reform? Are we going to see the legalization of recreational marijuana? There are so many issues that we're dealing with at the Capitol, Terry. Are we going to see anything that breaks a stalemate?
No. I don't think it means a damn thing. I mean, it was a nice headline, and I get, Leader Topper, who's been a guest on this program before, and a good guest for us actually. A sharp guy, and it's a new chapter for the Republican caucus, and we'll see what he intends to do. Certainly, he laid a marker down that was encouraging in the sense that he extended that olive branch so we can work together, and we're going to have to work together to get anything done. But I just, speaking of culture, we're talking about Harrisburg here, and I don't see anything that happened in the November election, and I don't see enough of a change of the cast of characters that would suggest to me that, for instance, Senate Majority Leader Ward's feelings about Governor Shapiro have somehow defrosted, right? Or
don't
that,
believe so.
or that Leader Bradford has decided to, I don't know, embrace bipartisanship because he's feeling some heat at home in Montgomery County. I don't see the imperatives for change in the mix, and so I think it's going to be a lot of the same. I think, maybe something like skill games gets done. I was at a chamber event not that long ago where both Senator Pittman and Representative Bradford talked about, their openness to working together to try to get something done. This transit funding issue is going to continue to be a sort of a ball and chain for the state legislator. So on the big issues, mass transit, education, some of these other big things we're talking about, I don't see anything that suggests that we ought to expect substantial change.
No, I thought it was smart not to make a huge fight over the speaker thing, because as soon either that rep from Allegheny County is going to come back or there'll be a replacement who will be a Democrat. It's a waste of effort to fight over that, I think. So that was a smart move, and maybe it sets a slightly better tone for cooperation, but I think you're right. The issues haven't changed. The parties haven't changed. The people haven't changed. No, I think they're going to butt heads as soon as they get into anything serious.
Well, and I think if I can just add that I think that Shapiro sets the tone for that, right? I think that, if he was a different type of leader and was really working towards bringing people together as he speaks to doing so, I think that we could have hope for a different type of outcome over this next year. But I think that he is actively working in a divisive nature. He could certainly extend the olive branch and get the scholarship money, for Kids Pass that he promised. He ran on a campaign to do so. And if he were to take a step forward to extend that olive branch, then I think that it really might open the door to a new era of bipartisanship that we have not seen in a very long time in Pennsylvania.
Todd, let's go down that road. The governor often talks about divided legislature, that you have the Republicans that control the Senate, Democrats control the House, how difficult it is to lead. But to Beth Ann's point, is he doing enough, in your opinion?
Doing enough to foster legislative compromise?
Yes.
Gosh, that's, man, if I worked every day in the Dome, I would feel comfortable answering that. But since I'm not a legislative beat reporter, I'm sorry, I got to step away from that question. I will say that, I just think it doesn't matter which governor you are, whether you're Gavin Newsom in California or Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Hurting that many personalities, even when they're on your team, it's hard. And the sheer number of, the way the construction of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, the number of representatives and senators, that just makes it that much more difficult for him. So, look, I just think that task is always a difficult one, even in one-party states like California. But I do want to take a quick second and pivot and talk about media bias very quickly, because here's one of the greatest media biases that I know of, and it's reporters are always biased towards drama. And a 101 to 101 house or a 102 to 101 house is great drama. And so from that standpoint, should be an interesting year.
It will be interesting to see how Shapiro pivots, though, right? I mean, obviously, the majorities are exactly the same in both the Senate and the House, But if you're working backwards from whatever his national ambitions may be, he's got to reelect in
Yeah.
26. There'll be a Democratic presidential primary in 28, of which his name is being kicked around, obviously. How does he position himself? What are the things that he needs to accomplish in order to be reelected, in order to be considered a serious contender in 2028? I mean, the thing about governors when their names are being kicked around as potential presidential candidates that's always interesting is it's when they have their political moment in the sun, but it rarely lasts because it's the nature of the job. Think about Ron DeSantis. Think about Scott Walker from Wisconsin. Think about Tim Pawlenty from it. I mean, these guys, it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to be in the White House sometime in their first term, that they were going to be the standard bearer for their party nationally. And even a Mitt Romney, who was very high profile, and I guess he ran in 08, right, and didn't become the standard bearer until 12. So if that's what he wants, I don't know. He didn't tell me. I'm not sure. Everyone says that's what he wants. I guess that's what he wants. But if that's what he wants, then in an election that went decidedly towards the Republicans, in a state whose trend lines are accelerating in the Republicans' direction, because one other thing that's worth mentioning in the context of not just this, but the other issues we've discussed, is that I think I saw the Republicans picked up another net 12,000 registrations in December, which, I mean, who's changing the registration after, like no one's talking about politics after that election, right? And yet they are continuing to make steady gains. I think that the Democrats in 2020 have 685,000 voter registration advantage. It's now down to 200 and something. I mean, that is a substantial swing. And so I think, there's this question out there: is Pennsylvania going to go the way of Ohio? Is it going to go the way of Florida? And if you are Josh Shapiro, you have a vested interest in either positioning yourself to be able to be the governor of a purple state that is trending to become a red state. And that's a very, very different calculation than than what Tom Wolf was dealing with in 2020, right?
Right. Right now, I think you have to ask yourself, has Shapiro spent too much time burnishing his national reputation at the expense of getting stuff done throughout the Commonwealth, and with the potential that Congressman Dan Muser is going to run for the Republican nomination and possibly oppose Shapiro in 2026, you got to think that the governor's really got to focus on the Commonwealth, because there's no national aspirations if you don't win re-election in 2026.
Yeah, and I think like what Terry was saying about how some other states' governor is always the next standard bearer, it's because they don't know what's going on here. People who are outside the state and they see, oh, Shapiro got like 60%. Boy, he must be really something. It's like, well, it was kind of a strange election. He had a weird opponent. Like things were. I wouldn't take that as a guarantee for Shapiro. We know that because we're here. And also, like Beth Ann said, he made some promises about education that could have passed the legislature with a little effort, but the interests and the groups kind of stood against him, and he didn't push it. So that's the sort of thing. If he wants to, and if you want to be a kind of national figure, it's got to be not just replacement level Democrat governor. It's got to be somebody who's like, I got education reform done in a party that doesn't want it, but the people do. I mean, if he actually got Lifeline scholarships, or they're called something different now, I forget. Yeah. If he got that done and it benefited people, and all these kids and their parents would be able to say, wow, my education is so much better now. I was in this school and it was failing, and now I'm good grades, staying in school. I mean, that's the commercials write themselves, the campaign writes itself. Right. Well, but he's got to like have the guts to get it done here in Pennsylvania before he can get it done anywhere else.
It's interesting because I was asked in an interview earlier this week about the Saving Women's Sports Act that a number of female senators in Pennsylvania are trying to reintroduce to save women's sports so boys can't compete against girls in sports. And I was asked, do I think that Josh Shapiro, if it passed the House and Senate, would veto it? And I said unequivocally, yes. I believe that he would veto it. He has sworn to veto that bill. He's on the record as saying he's going to veto that bill. And they asked me, well, from a national perspective, don't you think that will hurt him? And I said, I don't think it'll matter. I do believe that if it got to his desk, that he would veto it, because he's I think at his core, he likes to pretend that he is a moderate, that he is a populist, he is a centrist. He is not a centrist. He is not a populist. He may not be as far extreme as AOC or some of the others, but I think in his heart of hearts, that is in fact who he is. I mean, he posted trans women are women, pass it on. I mean, he feels very strongly about this. Under his administration, the couple of licensing boards passed rules that said that if a psychologist doesn't engage in gender affirming care, they can get their license disciplined. So if they don't work with a child to say, yes, if you think you're a boy, but you're a girl, we're going to work with you this way. If they were ever to suggest otherwise, well, maybe you're just having some problems, or maybe you're just confused, that person could actually get disciplined under their license, under the licensing board. So he has taken very extreme positions that are progressive, that he tries to pretend that he's not a part of, but that is in fact who he is. And I think he's going to struggle with that.
Todd, let me toss that to you since you got the ball rolling. What do you think Josh Shapiro needs to do for 2025?
I think the other big question here for him that we haven't touched on in the discussion yet is, with last year's budget, we heard the first little faint rumblings of maybe a tax increase, right? I think that will get stronger this year. But the question for me is how that intersects with the tax increases that we've already seen at the local level, like we've been covering at Broad and Liberty, and whether or not there's just fatigue. I mean, like whether or not the fatigue is so bad it could cause a revolt, right? Like you're talking a 23% tax increase in Delaware County, 13 in Chester. Remind me, panelists, what was it in Allegheny County?
17.
Anyone?
17
Yes, I mean,
in Allegheny.
almost
Maybe
20.
higher. 10 in Montgomery.
Right. And those are the counties. And so you still have a lot of municipalities and a lot of school districts that are doing the same things. And the question for me is whether or not the governor now has, like, I think he had a lot more leeway last year financially in this area than he does this year, just because, I mean, a real tax fatigue is starting to set in some of these areas, I think.
I think that kind of comes back to your question originally, Steve, about did they overread their mandate? And like Terry said, when some of these first Democrats came in, they were the first ones since the Civil War. And that was true of Shapiro in Montgomery County. When he and Leslie were the first Democratic county commissioners since Reconstruction or whatever it was, they kept the line, they held the line on finance. Like they were socially liberal, like you're saying, but they did not raise taxes. They raised them a tiny bit in the last year, like less than $100 per household. It was, they because they knew they had to conquer that reputation of Democrats being tax and spenders and just, tax increase every year. And they did. And it won a lot of people over in the county, and now it's a Democratic county. But now we've got 10% rate, and it's going to go up again because we have the same problem that Delco has with the ARPA money and everything else. They're using temporary funds for permanent programs. So it's going to go up again. And yeah, how much is enough? I mean, because they're rapidly giving away whatever advantage they had from 10, 15 years ago of being,
Right.
oh, we're socially liberal, but responsible with money. And like, well, no, we're not responsible with money either, but we're also super liberal.
Allegheny was 37%.
37%.
Ooh,
I said 17, and I was like, that number wasn't right. It was 37%.
That's a great point, Kyle. I think if you ask the majority of Pennsylvanians, maybe majority of Americans, they would say, yes, I am socially liberal, fiscally conservative. But at this point, with everything that is transpiring, at what point are you not as socially liberal as you thought you were? And when does the rubber band break when it comes to taxes, Terry?
Yeah. And what does that even mean anymore? I mean, what does it mean to be liberal or conservative? I mean, we're in the middle of a massive political realignment.
Yeah.
This is New Deal coalition, post like Reconstruction era kind of, if you're a student of American political history, you know that there are sort of these periods where there's sort of a status quo. And then there are periods where you have these smaller realignments where parts of the coalition sort of break off and move. And I think that's where most people thought we were 10 years ago, that there was definitely change happening, but we didn't have enough. We were too close to it to understand the scale. And I think the reality is that we can now say decidedly that we are in the middle of a massive political realignment, and people that those things that people like to throw around, like, oh, I'm socially liberal but fiscally, what does that mean? Really, what it tends to mean is I'm pretty libertarian on these kinds of things. I don't want the government involved in people's lives, but I also don't want to get taxed to death either. I want my government to be efficient, effective, and equitable. And as long as it does those three things and it focuses on the core services and does them well that have the most impact on my quality of life, for most people, they don't really care whether they're Republicans or Democrats. Let's face it, as long as that's what they're getting. The issue becomes when the ideologies within the parties become the dominant factor or the dominant prism through which policy decisions get made. And if that ideology is not congruent with the preferences of the electorate, then you get yourself in big trouble, particularly when preferences and attitudes are changing and it's hard to keep up, which is why pollsters are wrong. They didn't forget how to do their jobs. They're just not asking the right questions to the right set of people at the right time to capture the moment that we're going, because the change is happening too fast. And I would argue because of the era we're living in, the rate of change accelerates at a pace that is what maybe was not the case 100 years ago. So all that being said, we don't know more than we do know about what the future holds. But I think what we do know is that these coalitions are starting to settle in, that the Trump coalition is substantially larger and substantially stronger and substantially more durable than it was presumed that it was during, or could be during, his first term. And that what that means for Pennsylvania remains to be seen. But I think that is the context in which you're going to see a lot of these debates, both in Harrisburg and at the county level or at the regional level, play out over through 2025.
I know one. Oh, go
I
ahead,
got to
Tom.
jump
Sorry.
in there. Like just a very good example of that whole dynamic that Terry's talking about, like governing through ideology versus governing through core competency and delivering services. I mean, in a sense, Philadelphia is already a forerunner in this whole question, because like when you were talking like that, all I could think of was Mayor Cherelle Parker. Like I don't see her as taking these ideological risks. Instead, she's creating trash task forces. She's really bolstering the police department. I'm told morale is increasing there. So I think she's a good example of that kind of governance that it ought to be successful for Democrats.
And let's take a look at the other side of the state. In Allegheny County, the city of Pittsburgh is going to have a mayoral election. Incumbent Ed Gainey is being challenged by City Controller Corey O'Connor. And I think we're going to see a lot of what you have all talked about play out in just that race alone as well.
I think so. I think some people just want low taxes. That's it. But I think for a lot of people, if the schools are good, if crime is low, if the streets are clean, if it's a nice place to live, and the taxes are kind of high to pay for it, a lot of people say, well, that's the price we pay. It's okay. Like some of the suburban school districts, they are overfunded. Like you were saying, some people were saying, because those people vote for that. Because they're like, well, I want to have a great school, and this is how I think we're going to do it. And they're happy with that. So even if you equalize funding, they're going to raise it again. I think that competency is just it. I mean, compare Cherelle Parker to Jim Kenney, who was very popular with the groups, but not with the people, because the city went to hell. And some of that you can pin on Krasner, some of it you can pin on COVID, but it was also the mayor who was out to lunch and didn't really do anything or care if it got done. And when you couple that with also the high wage tax and all the other nonsense you have to deal with, it makes the city a less attractive location when it could be. I mean, there's a lot of great things about living in a city. If you don't have to deal with all the other crap.
Let me focus on one other topic before we wrap things up. And I wanted to talk about something that's near and dear to all of our hearts, the impact of media today. And who is trusted media? We're seeing legacy media, especially how it's being played out in the Washington Post right now. Questions are being raised about what Jeff Bezos is doing. You're seeing talent leave. Other media is growing, including organizations like Broad and Liberty or Politics PA. I'll start with you, Terry. What is the future that you see for media like us, media like them?
I'm just glad everyone's catching up to us. Listen, this has sort of been our organizing principle from the beginning, right? That the legacy media, solutions oriented journalism, advocacy journalism was doing a disservice to the people, and that our democracy functions best when citizens have all of the available information provided to them in a robust and fair way. And when the various perspectives, we're a nation built on a two-party system, so we'll say the two competing visions for the nation or the Commonwealth are provided with an equal and a level playing field, and equal. And the reality is that over the course of many many years, probably close to a century, uh, the that kind of mentality just became secondary to these other considerations. And but the barrier to, because of the technological revolution that we've been going through over the course of the last 25 years, the barrier to entry into the market is not what it once was. And so for those of us that really believe that quality media and things like Todd's work in investigative journalism and a level playing field are a civic imperative, are critical to the public good and the health of our democracy, the only way to change things was to start to build your own. And frankly, I was tired of conservatives bitching about the editorial pages in the Inquirer or the New York Times. Go make your own, man. Like, let's go talk to the people. We have the ability to do it. We can reach them on this thing. And so that's what we're doing. And it's what we've been doing. It's what others are doing, and it's changing the conversation. It is leveling the playing field. We see it, through the work that we do in county council meetings where people are saying, "I read this in Broad and Liberty," or "I read this in a local news report." They might not even know who we are or what we do or why. And I think that is so important. And honestly, this is going to sound maybe weird coming from me. I encourage progressives to jump in the game too, because you know what? Put it out there, right? Hold Republicans accountable. Don't let the Inquirer carry your water. Go tell us what your worldview is. Tell me why the 37% tax increase in Allegheny County is justified. Tell me why 24% on top of 5%, with another 14 or 15% coming next year, a 50% tax increase in Delaware County next year is justified. I want to understand what the ROI is for the citizens. I want to have that debate. So build your own media infrastructure and let's have that debate, because I think the only incremental service I've seen coming out of Delaware County Council recently was doing Delco Safely Day, where you get 10 free condoms. Well, look, I mean, okay, I'm not sure, seniors whose taxes are going up are particularly thrilled about that new incremental service, but come on, guys. So it is a unique moment in time for sure, but it is also sort of a thrilling moment in time as well. And so I say let's grab the bull by the horns and let's change the conversation, not just here, but across the country.
Todd, you've taught me a lot about open records and the importance of investigative journalism and how important that is. And I'm not sure necessarily our readers truly appreciate the work that goes into it. Why is it important for the citizens of the Commonwealth to have investigative reporters like yourself?
Well, when you're talking about investigative journalism, you're almost always talking about things that have to be researched that takes several days. And spending several days on just a single question that takes a lot of resources, right? And I say that at a time when the media, you know, the news industry for 25 years now, maybe longer, has not had a solid, reliable funding model. And so, look, when you don't have a reliable funding model, you start to cut the heaviest thing first. And usually the heaviest thing is the investigative reporting. Look, I know some investigative reporters, they might get 6 to a dozen reports out a year. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that just gets harder for someone that's got the financial ledger in front of them to say, oh, can we keep this up, right? As opposed to the reporter that does faster churn, less investigative stuff. I think about some of this stuff, again, just to take the Mustafa Jackson issue in Delaware County, where shortly after the prison was deprivatized, there was a inmate who died there, and they said it was a delayed homicide. We were able to uncover that the person had a bullet wound that was more than a decade old. He was a paraplegic because of that. And because of this, he was very vulnerable to sepsis, and he died of urosepsis. And this raises all kinds of questions about the quality of care he was getting in the prison. That's a good example of where that took that took more than a month actually to be able to get something like that. But I think it helps the citizens of Delaware County. That's an invaluable puzzle piece for them to understand what's going on, not just at their prison, but what's going on at the budgetary level when the county's asking for a 23% tax increase as well.
And Kyle, managing editor of Broad and Liberty, you compile all the information that's coming and picking out the important stories that readers need to know, and sometimes from voices they're not used to hearing from.
Sure. And I think it's like what Terry was saying, it wasn't getting done, so we had to do it. People are hearing things now, and we hear a lot about trust. The decline of trust, becoming a low trust society even, and that's true across the board. But in media, I think it's especially true because of organizations like ours. Now we can reach people through the phone, and not just us. I'm not saying that we are, we're taking on the entire establishment by ourselves, but there are so many little outlets now that can say, hey, there's another side to this story, or you interviewed this guy, but you didn't include it, or you didn't reach out for comment. We can do that. I mean, I think the key is, and this goes back to something Todd was saying earlier, is you tell the truth and you show your work. We were talking just today before the show about how a lot of places will reference a document and not link it. And in the internet age, that's so dumb. You're writing a story about a Supreme Court decision. You don't link the court case. Is it because you don't want people to read what's really in there? It looks shady. So we make the effort to say, here's what we think is true. And also you can look at it yourself.
Here's the document.
When something sounds complicated, we try to make an effort to explain, here's how we got to this point. These are the steps. Sometimes with the budget kind of documents, that takes more explanation. It takes more work from the journalist, but that builds the trust. And I think a lot of the legacy media, because they had that not a legal monopoly, but just a monopoly on how many big papers can there be and how many news stations can there be, they got lazy. And they got used to being the authority, so they can just say whatever they want. And I think because we have to prove ourselves in the marketplace, we, by necessity, work harder at that. And I think it brings rigor to the whole system.
And I think we'll leave it there. Our thanks to Todd Shepard, Beth Ann Rosica, Kyle Salmon, Terry Tracy for joining us today on Voices of Reason. My name is Steve Ulrich. Follow Politics PA and Broad and Liberty throughout 2025 for what promises to be a fascinating legislative session, and we will bring you more interesting guests and news throughout the upcoming year. For Voices of Reason, I'm Steve Ulrich. Thanks for joining us.